Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fingal's Cave podcast. Today we are going to discuss the Dark Side of the Moon January 1972 performances. Over a period of just over a week, Pink Floyd showcased their brand new piece of music, which would become their greatest work. Brighton, Portsmouth, Bournemouth, Southampton, Newcastle and Leeds. The first four are close to one another, then it was a long journey up the country to Newcastle, at least by UK standards, followed by a 2-hour trip to Leeds. Collectors have certainly struggled with these dates over the years, and there have been multiple misattributions, in particular in respect of dates. Over to Ian and Phil.
So I suppose the first question that some of our listeners might be wondering is why this particular topic? And on a related note, where's 1968? So let me address the latter thing first. We do still plan a 1968 episode, but we've been made aware of several threads of ongoing research, which once they bear fruit, will run the risk of making our own episode completely outdated, only potentially weeks or months after we've put it out. So we decided to hold off on that. And I hope it's not too much of a disappointment, but I hope the tantalizing prospect of being able to at least discuss the existence of more than we currently have from 1968 makes it worth it. Regarding January of 1972, why that in particular? Well, one thing is that we have this set of 6 shows that are obviously the first 6 public performances of Dark Side of the Moon, as well as their second sets and encores. We're lucky enough to have all those concerts in either their entirety or very close to it. And January also makes for a nice natural boundary because after that we get several performances of which tapes don't circulate, if they do indeed exist. So by finishing up with Leeds, we sort of have the nice half dozen set of those first performances kind of wrapped up in a nice bow. And then after that, things go a bit mysterious for a while. I think that clearly, given the success of Dark Side of the Moon, given the high esteem in which many of the band's fans hold it, all that sort of business, the relevance of the topic in and of itself is pretty obvious. I think, though, one thing that's worth asking right away is that many of us will know these performances as, Brighton in particular, we say to ourselves, that's the first performance of Dark Side of the Moon, which, as we'll discuss, it both is and isn't, or perhaps Portsmouth, if folks are a little bit better informed. But it's also worth reminding ourselves that this isn't the first time this material was actually performed, right? For starters, we have rehearsal tapes from December of 1971. Though we don't have them complete, we don't have everything that the band played at the time. They gave us a sense of where they were coming from. We also want to remind ourselves that some of this material had been played live before. Money is explicitly based on Moonhead, which dates all the way back to 1969, and the moon landing there. The solo section on that explicitly uses the same bass line. They're both minor blueses. And maybe more pointedly, the violent sequence, or one of its many names it's had, from the Zabriskie Point sessions, that was used during January and February 1970, and then was put on ice for a while until it became Us and Them. People have also speculated that Breathe had its origins at Taft Auditorium in 1971. And there's some resemblance there. I mean, the problem is that chord progression is a pretty common one. The Doors, for instance, used it in When the Music's Over pretty heavily. And the tempo is similar, but then again, by this point, Pink Floyd pretty much only had 2 or 3 tempos that almost all their songs were in anyway. I put it as a joking note to myself, slow, stately, and medium, where there are 3 tempos at this point.
Very good too. Makes them easy to listen to in the car as well, though, doesn't it?
It's true.
Because if we listen to things too quickly in the car, we get all distracted and do rash things.
Yes, I got a ticket that way once.
Yeah, I guess Careful With That Axe, Eugene, might have a similar effect on you, mightn't it? But it is. Yeah. It's good driving music.
It is.
And I might add to what you've just been describing there, because don't forget, things kick off in January as well, don't they? Because they rehearsed for 12 days from the 3rd to the 15th in the Rolling Stones basement in Bermondsey in East London. And then they did full production rehearsals at the Rainbow Theatre between the 17th and the 19th of January. So they were really working pretty hard on this piece then, weren't they? They clearly knew they had something that they needed to work on, perfect, and get out on the road.
Absolutely. And I think the ambition of what they were doing was very, very clear. We'll discuss Roger Waters' comments when the first performance at Brighton breaks down. He's joking about it being their masterpiece, but he's also not joking at all. he's quite clear that it's their new big thing. And obviously they're quite crestfallen that it fell apart. But as he says at one point, it'll be even better later on. We do have demos preceding all of this for some of these songs, like Time, Money. Both of them have circulating demos by Roger. And then my understanding is that Brain Damage was actually written around the time of the Metal Sessions and had been kind of floating around. So I think in a way it exemplifies what I've often talked about with Pink Floyd, that they really, a lot of the time, were taking existing fragments and assembling them into whatever their latest project was. I think we saw that happen with Adam Heart Mother. We saw it happening with A Man on the Journey. We see it happening with Echoes.
Yes.
And we see it happening here too. I'd like to run down some things that all these performances have in common. One of them is that they all are about the same length, roughly. In other words, they all clock in somewhere between an hour and 45 minutes and a good bit under 2 hours and 10 minutes. It's obviously complicated by the fact that things happen. Sometimes they tune a bit more, but none of them is 3 hours, and none of them, for that matter, are 75 minutes, which, of course, Pink Floyd didn't usually do that unless they were playing at festivals or special events like the Robert Wyatt benefit the following year. And I think as I listened back to these shows, one thing was really, really clear to me, which is that Echoes was so fresh in their minds. And so much of what they did in organizing this early version of Dark Side of the Moon seems to come directly from Echoes. In other words, they were saying, wow, that went really, really well. Let's try doing some of the same things. I understand that obviously many of our listeners are quite experienced veterans of Pink Floyd live recordings, bootlegs if you like, that they've listened to tons and tons of them. So some of what I'm about to say may be sort of obvious to some of them. But for those who might be a bit newer, there are some things that are perhaps a little bit surprising. I'm not going to go into how On the Run wasn't present yet. It was Travel Sequence. That stuff I think we'll take as assumed. But Travel Sequence was in its earliest form, right? It's very raw at this early state. And there were sections that sort of developed in that piece over time that just aren't present here. There's basically one thing that Nick Mason does. At one point, he goes whack, whack. And tells everybody to be on their guard. And that's about it. There's really nothing else other than kind of an open jam in E minor that section is. Time has a long intro, which is actually typical of 1972. But one thing that's striking is that on all 6 of these shows, they sing it, ironically enough, more like the studio take than they did later in the year, because they were singing it in a manner much like they approached Echoes, with Rick on top and David Gilmour below him. And so that means that Rick is singing many of the same notes that became customary on the definitive version of the song. But those of you who know your Pink Floyd recordings from 72 pretty well will know that for most of the year, they were singing Time, especially in February, March, April, May, those sort of formative performances that were memorialized most famously on the Best of Tour 72 bootleg. They're singing it at a very low, morose tessitura, range, in other words. The part is much lower and less kind of Promethean, if you want to call it that, than it became. And so it really resembles Echoes, with Rick on top and Gilmour underneath. And that went on until at least Sheffield, February 12th, which we won't be talking about today, but all the shows that we don't have were clearly the same way. And probably it was the case at Liverpool too, because then they had this 4-day break and they did those Rainbow shows, and they made several changes between, we're assuming, Liverpool and those Rainbow shows. So yeah, it's just funny that Time actually at the beginning sounds a bit more in some ways like it did eventually than the arrangement changes. The Mortality Sequence, the version they did was the version they did for the first 6 or actually 5 months of the year, but it ends actually in a less striking way than it did when it came time for the Rainbow shows. It almost seems a bit like something from Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast, where Rick just kind of ends with a harmony that's similar to what he had already been playing. Those of you with sharp ears will note that for those Rainbow shows, he switched over to using a harmony that actually, if you want to get technical in terms of music theory, it serves as the dominant for money. In other words, the harmony he plays is the chord that leads most logically into money. So he set that up consciously later on. And at first, the version of Mortality Sequence we have, or whatever you want to call it. And by the way,
it's a fair name.
Yeah, those of our listeners who are very careful about making sure that everything has the right name at the right time. Do forgive me if I call something a scat at one point and any color you like at a different point. My brain doesn't necessarily correlate names and dates perfectly. Does that change for the Rainbow shows? The obvious is that there's no sax solo in Money. There wouldn't be now. But also what's interesting is that Roger Waters is very avid about singing along during Money. For the most part, he sings either one note or occasional light harmonies, or sometimes in unison with Gilmour. So he's not doing anything particularly well arranged or sophisticated, but he clearly wants to be in there singing that tune. And that's quite consistent. There are little extra vocal flourishes in Us and Them. I think probably most listeners know that little ah pattern that happens. Any Color You Like is just a scat, scat, I should say. Scat number 2 is just scat.
Yes.
And reminded me, as I listened to a little bit of Eugene and a little bit of Echoes, or even Embryo, right? It's the kind of thing that very similar to the kind of playing he would do on that. And then I'm sure most of our listeners will know that Eclipse was not present on any of these performances. There's been a little bit of evolution in terms of research about that. It used to be believed it was 10th of February, Leicester. And I think there was an edition of Glenn Povey's book that said that that was the first performance. And then it got moved back to Bristol, the 5th of February. We know certainly that it happened in Sheffield, by the way, on the 12th of February. It's not clear to me whether we know definitively whether Eclipse was present at Coventry. It seems to make more sense. That was the 3rd of February. They had 6 days off, or maybe 5, between those gigs. So it would make more sense that Roger would have gone and worked on it during that longer interval. In any event, it didn't show up until early February. And instead, we get this wild ending when we get there, because of course we don't get there on the first show, where we have these synthesizer notes sort of rising and falling like sirens and sort of the woodblock sounds. And it's very quirky. And actually, it is odd, isn't it? It's really, quite mad. Yeah, it's really. I mean, there are times it gets quite psychedelic, and then there are times it sounds quite making it up as they go along. The thing that really struck me is that how does Echoes end with a bunch of rising tones? How is Dark Side of the Moon ending at this point with a bunch of falling tones? So it's yet another parallel where they were trying to kind of pull out the same trick, although I suspect that they knew even then that it was sort of a for now thing. They just wanted to get the piece up and running and worry about things. But clearly, the addition of Eclipse, much as those early endings are fun, it was definitely the better for it. 1972 sure does have a sound. And it's even independent of the fact that they're playing Dark Side of the Moon. There's something about these recordings, and maybe it's about the difference between American and European PAs. I'm not sure what it is. They're darker, and there's a kind of morose air to the whole thing, which is very different to my ears than recordings like San Diego, 17th of October, 1971. There's a kind of, I don't want to make too much of it, but I wouldn't quite say a gloominess to it, but the mood has definitely shifted. And it's darkened. I mean, we've also lost Fat Old Sun, Embryo, Cymbeline, Green is the Color, all these kind of pastoral, life-affirming tunes. But it still feels like 1972 has this flavor that feels like it takes a while to get lively. And I'm thinking only of like September with Hollywood Bowl, November with Berblingen, and then, of course, the addition of Childhood's End at the end of the year. That seems to be when it sort of shifts a bit. For a while, it's a remarkably kind of downbeat, morose vibe, not necessarily at the expense of the music, but it's really... You can really tell when something's a performance from the first half of 72 because it just feels different. It feels almost tranquilized at times.
I wonder what the biographers would make of that and the state of the interplay between the band members at that time. Perhaps there's something going on there.
Could be.
Perhaps it's because it's winter. But it's not something I've really thought about before. I think I better go back and listen to some of these recordings in a little bit more detail.
We hope everyone does, right?
Yeah, I'm certainly feeling very tempted. That was fascinating. Should we jump in?
I think so.
Should we go to the Dome in Brighton, East Sussex?
They do seem to love that town, don't they? Gilmore even lives there now.
Indeed, yeah. And as I do this discussion with you, in 2 days' time, I'm going to see him perform there, one of his warm-up gigs for his forthcoming tour. The Dome has come back into the Floyd world in recent years, of course, because Nick Mason's Saucerful of Secrets has played there a couple of times, 2,500 capacity. I went to both of those gigs and I was really struck by the auditorium. It's got a very intimate feel to it. It's got great acoustics. It's still really somewhat unspoiled. So my friends and I, who I went with to the concerts, we all agreed that it seemed pretty likely that the experience of going in 1972 was just like the experience of going in the 2020s. So that was lovely in itself. Of course, you got the band recollections at the time at the concerts, and they were usually wrong. Nick Mason's recollections are generally quite wrong at his concerts, but we don't worry about that because we're enjoying the show. So, setting the scene just a little bit more, if I may. Balcony tickets back on the 20th of January 1972 would have set you back £1.25. And I'm going to keep on going on about prices in this discussion, not for any deep reason, just because it feels like fun to do so. And that was pretty cheap at the time. And Pink Floyd were a pretty cheap gig to go to, which is obviously in very stark contrast to how things are now. And we have two tapers. But over to you again, Phil. Would you like to come back in?
Oh, sure. Just to take a moment to imagine what it must have been like for the band, right? I mean, again, I can't, for whatever reason, they seem to have an enduring affection for Brighton in particular. And I can't imagine it was completely an accident. I mean, from what you described at the start, I'm sure some of it had to do with logistics and distances between where everybody was. But Roger Waters at one point talks about the adrenaline coursing through their veins. I mean, this was a very, very big night for them. And I don't think it's an accident that they chose to start it here. You're mentioning the ticket prices. It'd be really interesting to see how ticket prices varied according to the occasion with them. Somebody out there, a doctoral student, should do their thesis or their dissertation on tracking Pink Floyd ticket prices based on the location, their affection for the area, and how new the material was being tried out. But one would like to think they charged a bit less if they were allowing their audience to sort of be their test market, as it were.
It is an incredible price, though, isn't it? £1.25 to go to see the opening performance of The Dark Side of the Moon. I think, I'm paying $35 after Ticketmaster got their slice for the concert that I'm going to at the weekend, which I thought was an extraordinary bargain because I've obviously been looking at the Royal Albert Hall tickets, and about the only way I could go and see one of those now is at £250, and it's quite an extraordinary thing, isn't it? And I suppose it says something about the band's relationship to the fans at that stage in their career as well, that things were different to how they had become. It was a good NME review for it. I think we both had a look at the NME review, didn't we, for the concert?
It's very interesting. It's actually one of the best and most informative reviews I can remember seeing from a concert because it answers a bunch of questions. Should we start out by talking about the recorders and kind of lay the scene there?
Yeah, let's do that.
We have a bit of news that might be interesting to our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are two recorders that we know of. The first one was Barry Cooper. That's quite widely known now. So Barry, if you're listening to this, forgive us, but it has come up all over the place on the internet. So I feel all right about naming you, and I hope you'll forgive me if you rather I didn't. And you can hear Barry's friend, Steve Bartram, calling out, "Here they come." So a couple of names there. Barry used an early Philips cassette recorder with a mono microphone. He was asked a few years back whether he could remember what the tape stock was, and apparently he laughed out loud at the suggestion that there would be any concerns about that. But Barry and Steve were quite inspired by this performance, and you can tell because you can hear some of the commentary as it goes through.
Some of which we can't repeat, by the way.
Indeed, we can't. And so inspired that they went back a couple of days later. Brings me to another name, Steve Bragger. Steve would undoubtedly strongly feature in this story if we weren't focusing on January alone, because he was very much involved from February onwards. And Steve, very good friends with Barry, and copied Barry's cassettes to high-speed reel-to-reel tape sometime, presumably fairly shortly after the concert, preserving their quality. And those are the best quality. That's the best quality source, rather, and that's in existence to this day. I don't think that one's out there. Various versions are out there, but not something directly from those reels. But
a lot of them are a mess too. This is one of those dates where
indeed,
little bits have been chopped out of a lot of copies.
Lots of that going on. I think you might agree, Phil, that probably the best copy is one that Yishkul member Neon Knight released. And that came from Danilo Stefanino in Italy. Danilo got his cassettes, his TDK SA90 and SA60. Excuse the nerdy detail there, but I know this is what I come to be expected for. And those were shared online in 2016, and Steve had copied those for Danilo. So nice second-gen versions, and that probably is the best version available to most people at the moment. So the way to look that one up is Neon Knight 2016 and Brighton. There's a recorder too.
There is.
As you're alluding to there, Phil, and a 56-minute version of that was shared 10 years ago. It is a long time. That sounds like a Dark Side of the Moon lyric, doesn't it? 10 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And in 2014, and that one faded in the last seconds of Breathe, and that tape ended with Careful That Axe Eugene. So the recorder was found to have some extra time between Money and Atom Heart, Mother and Before Careful, which led people to think, let's put them together. So there was some good work done then. Now, since then, not much happened until, rather interestingly, this April. I was on a visit to Mick the Hat's house and looking around some of his cassettes. He was playing me some rather interesting cassettes, as Mick often does. And he had a box of cassettes, which was kind of like an arm's length away from me. And I'm looking at the spines and I'm seeing Pink Floyd, 73, 77, all that type of thing. And there's one there that stands out to me. And it's a 1975 EMI C120 cassette. And I'm thinking, hang on, I wonder what's on that. And I read on the spine a little bit more closely that it's Brighton. And I start thinking, here goes Mick the Hat with one of his discoveries again. And Mick said to me, as he often does, because he's very generous, that it would be fine for me to take away a few cassettes to digitize them. And I sometimes help him with his collection in that way. And that was the one I wanted above any others, because something from 75, a 120 cassette, great sign. I think I've said that on one of these podcasts before. 120 cassettes from the 70s are always a really good sign, it seems. So it turned out to be, of course, as you might well have guessed from the introduction, a complete recorder too. And not only that, it's a big improvement on the incomplete copy. Lots more high end that was previously completely missing. I'm sorry to say, having built that all up, that we haven't done anything with it. And at the moment, there is just a raw transfer stage. So it has been preserved. There is an obvious opportunity here, I think, to make a mono surround from the two mono audience recordings, mastered to quadraphonic sound. And those who are familiar with the scene and have been around for some time might know that there's a guy called Jim Fisheye who's rather good at such things. And it seems to me that it might be nice for him to work on that at some point. So the recording is almost complete, but there's something that goes a bit awry at the end. I think you should have the pleasure of sharing that little fact, Phil.
At the very end, it suddenly changes dramatically in sound quality. It becomes clear that it possibly patched. And of all the places from which I would imagine someone would patch a tape like that, it had to be one of the least likely imaginable, which is that another date we'll be talking about, Northumberland, 1972, the 27th of January, that gets patched in to finish the last little bit of it off and to get the end of A Saucer Full of Secrets. And that's interesting for one reason above all. Soon enough, everybody knew about shows like Rainbow, 1972, perhaps the Japanese shows weren't getting around then, but there were other 1972 shows. So for somebody to pick that show, of all shows, as their patch source, seems to suggest that this copy was made very early in the training days, I think. I mean, also the dating of the tape. And it might suggest that there's some connection between the taper of Recorder 2, whoever they might be, and the taper of the 27th, who is also, as far as I know, unknown to us. We'll talk about that person a little bit later. But yeah, it was one of those real Sherlock Holmes moments where you say to yourself, of all things, that? But there it was.
It's very tempting to think there's a link between those two recordings, isn't it?
Particularly because it's not the kind of tape that would have gotten around a lot. People would have listened to a lot of it and said, perhaps we could do a bit better than that, sound quality-wise. But we'll talk about that in due time.
Brighton Recorder 2 is better than Newcastle. I call it Newcastle rather than Northumberland.
Oh, okay. So,
Northumberland's the county.
got it. Okay.
So
you can tell which side of the pond I'm on if my accent hadn't given it away already.
Watch out for American accents later in this discussion as well. So Recorder 2 is an hour and 54 minutes long. Recorder 1 is an hour and 46. So, you get 8 more minutes for your money. That cassette, the Recorder 2, came from a track called Trevor H, let's call him. And Trevor was from Wallasey in Merseyside. So nowhere near Brighton and not really very near Newcastle either, to be honest.
And not from the United States either. People will find
certainly not there, no. Not to say that Trevor was the taper, because he wasn't a taper as such. He was a guy who had a decent tape collection and was always happy to trade, so says Mick, to get a bigger inventory. Sad news with Trevor, I'm afraid, is that he died a couple of years ago. He was friends with Derek for many years and was in that same circle that people were beginning to pick up on that I keep going back to here. He was in that circle with Derek. So one of our very earliest episodes of this podcast series with Mick the Hat, that is, and Paris John, who gets a healthy mention in Mick's and Derek's podcast episodes. So yeah, this is that circle broadening now, and it seems to be a good direction in which to take things, and we might come back to more of that circle in a future episode because I found somebody else from it, but we won't get distracted by that now. Just leave that one out there and keep our fingers crossed that we can share some information there as well. So we talked about the background, we talked about the tapes. Tell us what we're listening to here, Phil.
It's a very, very interesting performance. I mean, for starters, everybody needs to go into it. It's a bit like, I suppose, knowing the end of the Titanic. You need to go into it knowing that you're not going to get the whole thing, that it's going to collapse in rather spectacular fashion halfway through. But as we listen, I think the first thing that strikes me at this first performance of Dark Side of the Moon is that while Breathe is a little bit unstable at the start, they seem to be maybe not entirely agreeing on where the downbeat is. They sort of link in pretty soon. You can tell that they're pretty well rehearsed. This is not something that they've just kind of whipped up at the last minute, but that compared to something like, for instance, let's say the 14th of April, 1969, where they were clearly scrambling, this definitely, you can tell that they put a lot of work into the actual transitions and the grooves and things. One thing that's interesting is that on the next couple shows that we'll hear after this, Gilmour sings it less like the album, but on this very first performance, he sings Breathe a bit more like the album. In particular, on the next two shows at Southampton and Bournemouth, he comes in right on the downbeat, which for those who aren't musicians, it's sort of tough to explain why that feels different. But there's a big difference between having him come in right gangbusters singing Breathe and having that little delay which allows the first chord to hit and then he comes in. It has a very different emotional quality, let's call it. So, and something else you'll notice, if you hadn't known this already, is that he sings Pick Your Own Ground, not Choose Your Own Ground. And that's something that I'll take note of when that shifts. By the way, there are some lyrical differences throughout, some of which I don't think anyone has ever properly explained why Rick kept singing Lying Supine in the Sunshine well through 1975. I don't know that anyone's ever asked after that, but there will be some lyrical differences like that. He also sings Stumble Toward an Early Grave, which is another noticeable thing. But really, all the basics are there. And as you listen to the next couple songs, it's quite clear that everything we expect from an early Dark Side of the Moon is present. The only really striking thing is that when we get to Breathe Reprise, aka Scat number 1 at this point, or I think it might be called Scat number 1, there are no lyrics. This is the only show, actually, as far as I know, where that transition from time to the mortality sequence has no words. So it's hard to imagine that after all the rehearsing, Roger decided at the last minute that it needed some words. So it's very interesting to speculate why it doesn't have any words. Did Gilmour just forget, or did Roger really say, okay, that needs some words. Let's use those lines. I have no idea. But that's one of the ways in which the show is unique beyond the fact that it collapses spectacularly. So speaking of that collapse, right, there's this loud buzzing sound that starts out halfway through the mortality sequence or toward the end of it. And we can hear some things that are a little funny beyond that. The FX tapes for Money are clearly delayed, but above all, there's this very loud buzzing sound. And you hear them, somebody, it might be Gilmour, it might be Waters, singing the first few lines of Money without a mic or without benefit of amplification in any event. And then they kind of stop and there's a pause. And by the way, this is one way in which it's incredibly important that we have unedited copies of these tapes out there, because there are people who honestly believed that they went right into Atom Heart Mother as soon as everything went sideways, and that did not happen.
Yeah.
There was a long delay.
No, they didn't.
Yeah.
No. Yes, there was a lot of thought.
There really was. And I've seen people say, you know, wow, it's amazing that Pink Floyd were so poised that they went right into Atom Heart Mother. Did not happen. They certainly weren't planning on pulling out Atom Heart Mother from all appearances. And actually, it's quite a clever bit of improvisation because it's something they knew they could do. It didn't require any taped effects. Now, we have the benefit of Nick Mason telling us exactly what happened, which is he did this interview. It was the NME, right? And he said, basically what happened was the most incredible tone started rushing through the PA. The new lighting system is run off a separate circuit, and due to some power failure somewhere, we had to double up on the circuit. So it was on the same circuit. there was a variac on the lighting system which went wrong and shorted out the PA. So it was impossible to get any tapes through, any sounds through, and we stopped because there was nothing we could do. It was a big disappointment to use old stuff, but it couldn't be helped. I think probably it was better to do that. But then he says later on, frankly, I thought some of tonight was fantastic, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. But I find it very interesting because it was the fact that they couldn't play their tapes, I think, above all, that derailed them. They were able to get vocals back pretty quickly, but they couldn't do their taped effects, at least not the way they wanted to. And I think that's, they must have made the executive decision.
It's crucial.
Yeah, I think they made the decision they'd rather not do it than miss out on those things. So I don't think the disaster was as bad as, for instance, Detroit, Cobo Hall, 5th of March, 1973, where a pyrotechnic explosion destroyed their PA. They put together what they could for the rest of the night with spare parts and then combed the entire countryside looking for a replacement PA. And that story was recently told, and it's quite fascinating. It makes me wish we had a tape of Detroit 1973, because without that, we won't know the full story. Anyway, Roger has this great quote about, due to severe mechanical and electronic horror, and it's interesting, he laughs nervously, which I've never heard him do at any other time. He genuinely sounds.
That's true, isn't it? Gosh, you do spot the details, Phil. You're absolutely right.
He sounds so sheepish, and I can't remember any other time he sounded like a kind of schoolboy caught with, without doing his homework or something like that. He really does sound off. So he says, we can't do any more of that bit, so we'll do something else. And then they count off into Atom Heart Mother. It doesn't have the tapes because, of course, it wouldn't have the tapes. And they only played Atom Heart Mother about 5 or 6 times. 6, I think, is the number that we know about. In 1972, they did it twice in Japan. It almost seems like they might have taken a request, which is probably the only time Pink Floyd ever took a request, at least without Sid Barrett in the band.
Their thing, yeah. They played it in Germersheim, didn't they?
Yeah, they did, yeah.
May 72.
And then they finished it up, which was caught on video by an intrepid team of filmers as the opening number the next day in Amsterdam. And that was it. It never showed up again until Gilmour played it with Ron Geeson many, many years later. So, yeah, I think the fact that they're sort of upfront about their own emotions, they talk about the adrenaline coursing through their veins a bit later. And Roger Waters says, when they start the second half, they say, I'm sorry we didn't get to the end of our masterwork. We didn't even get halfway through our masterwork. This is, by the way, a bit easier to hear on recorder too. But we'll try to make a point at the end of the tour of coming back and getting through it right to the end. So, and as some may know, not only did Brighton, not only one, but 2 performances and a film of some of it and a soundboard recording of some or all of it, which we hope Pink Floyd will release in its entirety someday. And then, as I mentioned, he says it should be a lot better by then anyway, because, of course, it's the first performance. And then David Gilmour makes a funny little comment. He says, "Can I have as much volume as Roger, please?" And the crowd the crowd picks up on the humor of that. A little bit of jockeying for position, even in 1972, I think.
Yes.
I should mention, by the way, these 2 recorders, right? One of them is sort of, there's a classic pattern that happens over and over and over again, even up into the Wall shows, where you'll have 2 recorders. One of them is further back and much more pristine and captures everything very nicely, and often doesn't have that much commentary from audience members, although in this case, our recorder 1 does. And then the recorder 2 often feels like it's closer to the stage and more in the thick of it, and it's got a lot of bass, and it sort of feels like you're right there, but it's muffled, right? Because the person's closer to the stage, and perhaps they're literally hiding the recorder in their pocket or putting it on the floor. And that's the combination we get here, where we get the kind of further, although not by any means terribly distant capture, which is very pristine and clear and very, almost a little bit clinical. And then the recorder 2, which feels like you're right there in the thick of it, in row 4, watching Pink Floyd, but it sounds like you're using the kind of tape deck that they would have had then.
Yeah, I don't know how the seating was there then, because I think it's possible that Barry was actually in the front row for that concert.
Oh, wow.
Because there is one account that says that he sent off tickets using a postal order. Do you have postal orders in the US?
Money orders, we do. People pay their rent with them.
So they used to be really popular then. It was just like another form of cash, like a safe way of sending cash for something that mattered. And I've seen one account that suggests that he actually was in the front row, although I agree it doesn't really sound like the front row. And the front row at the Dome now is like the front row of most concert venues. It clearly is close to the stage, not far off touching distance. So it's something perhaps we need to get to the bottom of a little bit more. But like you were saying there, Phil, it's the 2 recordings, they mesh together, and the sum is so much greater than the parts, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And that's the beauty of it.
This isn't one of those times that we can reconstruct the stereo imaging from the 2 recorders. That's quite magical when that happens, but at least we can get more perspective. And by the way, I remember reading a report that for at least some of these shows, they pulled out the first couple rows of seats I think it was from Coventry. There's a report that they actually removed the first couple rows of seats in the auditorium to make extra space for what that might tell us.
I mean, it still goes on now. I don't know. I mean, sorry, going off into far less interesting stuff, but this Gilmour concert that I'm going to in a couple of days' time, the capacity compared to his warm-up concert in 2015 has been completely slashed. So there's going to be 1,500 of us there on Saturday. There was 4,500 back in 2015, and a big area has been taken out. I don't know quite why they've decided to do that, but I suppose you can't just you can't sort of take it for granted, rather, that the seating would be just as it is now, and that there wouldn't be some sort of different arrangement there on the night for whatever that particular purpose was at the time and whatever the thinking might have been. So, yeah, fascinating concert, isn't it?
Absolutely. There's a nice review, and I think the person who reviews it gets it just exactly right. The reviewer says, "This nervous pressure on the band resulted in one of the most brilliant sets I've ever heard them perform. Echoes was masterful. The vocals came over clearly. What they achieved on the album they strove to perfect and did so successfully." Echoes is very good. The one that's really striking is A Saucer Full of Secrets. It's one of the best versions I've ever heard from 1972. They seem to really get tired of it sometimes, and they even did a short version, which was a terrible idea, where Gilmour doesn't sing at the end on a few occasions. I think that there's something that happens with Pink Floyd, and I've noticed this on a few different shows. When something goes really wrong, sometimes they play at their absolute best. And what it reminds me of, I remember the recently retired tennis player from Scotland, Andy Murray. He was known as a very cerebral player who would always do whatever it took to win, and was very strategic and often not very flashy at all. And I remember seeing him play once where he was quite injured somewhere in the middle of the match. And so he had no choice but to blast every shot as hard as he could, and basically to try to win points in as few shots as he could. And it was spectacular. It's like, oh, he can hit all these shots. He can hit like a World War I howitzer. It was absolutely breathtaking. He didn't win. This was, I think, against Marian Cilic, if I recall correctly. He didn't win, but he took it to 5 sets. And it was just one of the most hair-raising matches I've ever seen, because this person who's normally known for being cerebral and perfectionistic, he yells at himself after every mistake. I wonder if that reminds us of anybody, right? He had to swing for the fences, and he did. So I think Pink Floyd sometimes, when they know they're not going to be able to deliver the perfect concert that for some reason all 4 of them seem to have wanted to do, they kind of relax and they just start saying, well, if we can't give them perfection, let's give them one hell of an experience they won't forget. And I think you can hear that on A Saucer Full of Secrets.
To use the cliched phrase, they throw caution to the wind, basically.
Exactly. And that's really what it's all about.
Just let go.
Yeah. And it makes such a difference when they do that. You can really feel the difference. So a special night, despite the disappointment for the band.
And summing up, going back to the NME, their summing up was the Floyd inventiveness had returned and astounded the Capacity House. And indeed it did. I mean, they weren't focusing in that review on how things went wrong. Everybody was part of the experience. And I suppose it is a little bit like a concert where something goes wrong, because your audience always wills the best from you, doesn't it? And again, it's like the same with the sporting analogy, isn't it? Where the audience just wants to see the record broken, or the hardest shot, or whatever it might be, the spectacular goal. And that happened undoubtedly that night. I wonder how it left them feeling.
Yeah, I'm sure no one in the audience ever forgot it. That's for sure. Like, I think if you were there on the night.
So they must have felt double feelings, mustn't they? The disappointment of their masterpiece misfiring, but also they must have surely have recognised that actually they nailed it after that misfortune.
Absolutely.
Should we move on a day? Are you ready?
And for those of our listeners, we're not going to cover every day in the same depth as we just did for Brighton, but it was a particularly special concert.
And so the next day they were in the Guildhall, Portsmouth, which for anybody not in the UK is rather close to Brighton, not very far at all down the coast, different county from Sussex to Hampshire, but not a long journey. You'll remember the £1.25 price. This one was £1, but I only know the price for the Grand Circle, which would have been a fairly good ticket, I suppose, but that would have been £1. This date, we've mentioned Barry Cooper as recorder 1 for the 20th, is often attributed to Barry as well, but he wasn't there. He was at Bournemouth, which is obviously the next date, so we won't talk about that now. This is the first example we have of a completely unknown taper. And just to dwell on that a moment. I obviously mentioned this in the context of the 20th, but there were quite a lot of people selling live cassettes of various bands at the time. In 1972 in the UK, that had really got underway. And talking to Mick the Hat about this, he was saying to me that many of these tapers were becoming tempted to get a few local shows under their belts to add to their lists. And you can often spot those recordings, be it Pink Floyd or whatever the band is, because they're pretty average in quality. But if you can get to the master, they can be really relatively decent. And of course, you'll remember from Mick's story, if you haven't listened to that yet, you really do need to.
Yes.
That many of those individuals who are in the bootlegging world fell foul of the BPI, and the same was happening in the cassette world as well. And if you remember really well, Derek alluded to that a little bit in his episode as well. And the BPI would, at this stage in the UK, hound tape sellers just like they would go after vinyl sellers. And so a lot of recordings got trashed back then. And then others, of course, as naturally happens, and we see that even now today, traders move on from the hobby. And in those days, they would often just simply dump their tapes. Mm-hmm. So that could be what's going on here with Portsmouth, because we don't know much about it. The best copy doing the rounds at the moment is supposedly 4th gen. We just mentioned Germersheim, which was 21st of May 1972. It's got nothing to do with this conversation. But that was taped by Martin Balsam, the late Martin Balsam, who went by an online moniker of Marble. And he happened to have this Portsmouth. It was the best version going and doing the rounds. And his was supposedly 4th gen. He had it on Maxell cassettes and TDK, and a combination of the two. And he got that back in 1983. Mm-hmm. And Martin's copy times in at 2 hours and 13 minutes. I'm pleased to say I've still got Martin's copy of the cassette, and I think we might be able to do something a little bit better with that as well. So we could improve on Brighton, and I think we could improve on Portsmouth. Mm-hmm. Talking to Mick the Hat the other day, he believes that he may have a better copy of Portsmouth, but we will just have to find that one. I don't know about you, Phil, but I think, obviously we're going to talk about how this is the first complete performance. Mm-hmm. Credit to the taper, mm-hmm. because he got Dark Side of the Moon onto a single side of a tape, which was a good achievement. And if his best copy surfaced, if a master or a first gen surface for this, and if it were put in the right hands, this could be a really very good recording. I hope you agree.
I do.
It could be really very listenable indeed. So carrying on a little bit more, if I may, Phil, before I hand back over to you, I was talking a little bit to Jim Fisheye about this one, about where it might have been recorded from. And Jim is production and mastering engineer in the US. And I'm going to read a little bit quickly from what Jim said to me. Jim said, "I'm hearing keyboards right in my face. Low mids from the bass are strong. Guitar and drums are way away. The vocals are sounding like they're ricocheting off at least 3 walls before hitting the recording microphone. It sounds like one surround speaker is pretty near, one is pretty far, and others are in between." He wonders whether this taper was by the side of the stage next to Rick Wright. And he feels like he can hear instruments being recorded directly from the side of the stage. So if you listen to this one next, picture yourself looking directly at Rick playing, and maybe your imagination and the sound that you're hearing may coincide with one another, and it might heighten your experience of listening to this recording. So over to you, Phil. What do you make of this one?
And so that mental picture would put us, I think, using the Floyd setup, that would put us at stage left or the audience's right? In other words, sort of off toward the right. I think so. First of all, there are going to be some of these recordings that I would say, don't try them on your friends. When we get to a couple of the later ones in this set, it's going to be very difficult to recommend that anyone outside the hobby really spend any time with them. This, on the other hand, is quite decent. It really is. I agree that if we had a copy of the master or first gen, and it was properly cared for, it would be a very, very nice, well-positioned mono capture. Yes, not all the instruments are equally balanced, but I think what we get, we get quite nicely. Some things to listen out for are that Gilmour makes a bit of a hash of the lyrics on Breathe. If I hear it correctly, he sings, choose your own ground, look around, pick your own ground. So he sort of mixes and matches a little bit for whatever reason. That's not the only time he has trouble with the lyrics, which frankly, for a project as lyrically dense as Dark Side of the Moon, I don't much blame him. He also sings, you rush toward an early grave. So there are little things that sort of get varied. The thing that I noticed about the Dark Side of the Moon part of the set was really toward the second half. First of all, it's just remarkable how confident Money and Us and Them sound, right? I mean, this is the first performance of Us and Them as such. And basically speaking, the first performance of Money, because they didn't get more than a tiny bit of it done. Oh, I meant to mention, by the way, isn't it so interesting that Roger Waters said on the previous night, we didn't even get halfway through our masterpiece, which is so interesting because it's not true of the album, but it's true of the amount of time that everything was taking at that point. In other words, at that point.
Oh, really?
Yeah, at that point, Money.
You've done the maths, have
you? No, I'm going to take a chance, but I'm pretty sure that if you do the math on these early performances, the midpoint comes during Money sometime. Whereas, of course, we know that Dark Side of the Moon ultimately flipped the record over after Great Gig, right, and before Money. So it's so interesting that he was thinking of Money as the beginning of Money as not yet being the halfway point, which is sort of an odd thing from our point of view. But yeah, Money, Us, and Them, they just sound so confident. They don't sound, Money especially, just sounds like they're in their element. They're having no problem with this 7/4 thing. And when Gilmour gets to cut loose, he's entirely happy about it. The song that became Any Color You Like, the scat section, Gilmour is still kind of improvising his way through that outro. It still sounds a little bit like he will benefit, as he often does, from figuring out what melody he wants to use to end sections. That's something that you hear Gilmour do a lot. He has to figure out the tune, and then from that point on, he works based on that tune he's got in his mind. On Brain Damage, instead of Roger and David singing the kind of responses, you can't quite talk about verse and chorus on that song, if nothing else, because they never sing the title in that way. But if we talk about the lunatic sections as the verses, and then the and if the sections as the choruses, it sure sounds to me like it's Rick and David singing, and Roger is not singing. And it's when you pay attention, when you pay attention to that, it's really interesting how that changes it, because it turns them into kind of almost like a Greek chorus, responding to what Roger has said. I think it doesn't quite work as well, honestly. I think actually the song is much better off when Roger is protagonisting, so to speak, his way through the whole thing. Yeah, I think that's the only song that happens on, or the only performance that happens on, and I think that's another one of those changes that were wisely made. And it's another way in which it, by the way, resembles Echoes a little bit, but that's another conversation.
Do you think it's possible that Richard Wright is saying after the first night, or after the rehearsals, that this isn't working, Roger? I'm gonna show you my way of doing it.
Perhaps, or I think I get the impression that over time Richard Wright wanted to sing less and less. It might have been that Roger was pushing to sing more and more, but he was uncomfortable with lead vocals, and he was a smoker. His voice was beginning to not be as comfortable singing higher up, and I get the impression he had been assigned a lot of higher parts, like on Echoes, which by 1975 he's struggling to sing. I have a feeling he's kind of backing out of his role as high harmony part. And I think that's definitely part of it. I think his voice is getting tired. And again, any number of substances, legal or illegal, can gradually take a toll on your vocal cords. So that's my guess. He doesn't, I don't think he wanted to sing much beyond that part he gets in time and harmony parts. And then we have a moment I think a lot of people enjoy, which is when the whole thing, Dark Side of the Moon, ends. And it's just, as we discussed earlier, it's just bizarre.
It's strange, isn't it? It's worth if you do one thing, and maybe you might not want to listen to all of these concerts, but locate that and scroll to that bit and have a listen. And yeah, it's odd.
I mean, it almost makes me expect Fozzie Bear to come on stage and go waka waka. It's very, it's almost comical. It ends with the opposite of a bang, with this kind of strange, discordant whimper. And one thing that's interesting, by the way, as we'll discuss, there's a tape loop that shows up at the end very consistently, and I don't hear it at all here. It could just mean that the taper is placed in such a way that it's not, that he wasn't close to one of the speakers to which it was maybe panned, but there's a looping laugh that you hear on the other performances. I can't hear it at all.
There's not on this. I was listening to it last night. Definitely don't recall a laugh.
No. And then we get a couple interesting twists in the second half. One of them is that, as far as I know, there was only one concert. I may be wrong. Maybe there was another one in 1972 that doesn't have Careful with That Axe, Eugene on it, and it's this one. It just for whatever mysterious reason. I've seen a couple of people say something that I think is nonsense. They said, oh, the band swapped back and forth between Set the Controls and Careful with That Axe, Eugene. That's not true. They played Careful with That Axe, Eugene at every possible opportunity. It was the easiest thing in the world. Nothing could go wrong. The crowd loved it, and there's no such thing as a mistake, basically speaking. It was 14 minutes of them to come down from whatever they might have had at the interval, let's say. But they don't play it. And Roger Waters says this is the only oldie in the show, which is a sort of interesting statement. And so they play Set the Controls, they play Echoes. There's really not too much to say about it. The crowd absolutely demands an encore. And something I noticed at this show and the previous one, there's a lot more back and forth between the band and the crowd than there is later in this set of shows. And when they say they're playing A Saucer Full of Secrets, they're thrilled. They're very, very happy with it. The crowd clearly is. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, of all the 1972 shows, I don't know of a single other one that doesn't have Careful with That Axe, Eugene. There was even one show that they did that was only 2 songs. And one of those 2 songs was Careful with That Axe, Eugene. That was Manchester, the 11th of February, 1972, which is another one they had to do.
Also was abandoned.
Yeah, it was abandoned, and they did 2 makeup shows. So that, I mean, if I were going to a Pink Floyd concert in 1972 and I found out the one I went to was abandoned, I'd be thrilled to know that there were 2 more coming to my city in relatively short order.
Yes. That goes back to that point earlier, doesn't it, about the connection with the fans, which was evidently really quite strong at that point.
It does seem to have been. Yeah, they seem interested in engaging, and that diminishes with each of these shows that we talk about. So shall we go to the next step?
To the Winter Gardens in Bournemouth. Yep, another little jaunt along the coast. So us Brits know all of these places quite well as places where you either go and get your ferry or you go for your summer holiday. Bournemouth very much had a reputation at the time as being a slightly old-fashioned place to go. It's the place where your parents went for their honeymoon or the like if you lived in southeast England. So you get your cheapest ticket here so far. You can get a seat in the stalls at Bournemouth for 75p. That would be very good value indeed. I want to go back just to recap very quickly. We've been talking about Barry Cooper. Barry Cooper's Recorder 1 for the 20th of January. Some people had him as the Portsmouth taper. He's not the Portsmouth taper, but he is Recorder 2, as we mostly know him, for Bournemouth. That's the recorder who just caught Dark Side of the Moon. And when you know that and you listen to his capture of Brighton and you then listen to his capture of Bournemouth, it's pretty obvious that we're using the same recording equipment here, that early Philips mono recorder, basic microphone with it. So Barry was overwhelmed and he declared Dark Side of the Moon to be a masterpiece after seeing it at Bournemouth and was extremely glad that he captured it. Came back with that news to Steve Braggart, who, as I say, then thoroughly engaged with the February 1972 Rainbow Theatre concert. So all of these guys are linked. And this is one of the things that I like to come back to in this series. All these tapers were linked. They all know each other. They still know each other now. So Steve knew Mick the Hat. They're still in contact now. And, they don't see each other every day or anything like that, but they've all got happy memories. And we have got a lot to thank these intrepid tapers for, those people who went out with these machines and captured these concerts, because they were a very small set and quite an inspiring lot. So let's look at the 2 recorders quickly there. So Recorder 1, there's a couple of versions around for that. There's a supposed 3rd gen that was copied to CDR via a DAT, which is quite commonly available. That was circulated in 2004. There's a more interesting one, which was possibly a 1st gen. We're talking about Recorder 1 here. And that was transferred by Dave Carlin in 2010 using a Sony Professional Walkman, the classic machine that so many of us used to go to concerts with back in the day. So let's focus on that one. It's in some ways it's a little bit darker than the supposed 3rd gen, but it's got a little bit more of a convincing lineage, I would say, a little bit safer, I think. So Dave borrowed that cassette from a chap called Andy Garibaldi. And guess what? Andy Garibaldi was good friends with, you can finish it for me now, Mick the Hat. And with all of those people, they were all once again linked together. But Dave didn't know this, as he told me this recently. So Andy was in Mick the Hat's circle, and like Trevor H, who I just mentioned, he didn't tape anything either. And he didn't, according to Mick, have anything different in particular to anybody else. So Mick once again thinks that it might be worth him having a dig around to see what he can get from his collection for Recorder 1 from Bournemouth. So how did Dave get that cassette to transfer it? Well, he was friends with Nigel Bradder and has been friends with Nigel since the 1980s. And Nigel Bradder is obviously a taper as well, pretty well known for that. Nigel knew that Dave was competent with Adobe Audition and transferring cassettes, and he knew Nigel, and the cassette then got passed on to Dave to do the transferring job. The tape is now long gone, sadly, not through fault of any of those people concerned. It was just one of those things. People used to often dispose of cassettes back in the day once they were digitised, and now people like me rue that, obviously, because I want to have a go as well and to see what I could do. Dave tells me that he doesn't remember the cassette type, so it wasn't something obvious like a Maxell or a TDK or a Sony or anything like that, and he was almost certain that it was a normal bias tape. So I'm imagining quite a strange one, an early one, like a number of the tapes that are doing around. Perhaps it was another EMI 120 or something like that. He had another connection between tapers here. So it's the same set of people who have got Recorder 1 and Recorder 2. So yeah, Andy's cassette, less bright, likely first gen, missing a little bit here and there, tends to happen. Some of it's better, some of it's worse. Taper is adjusting his recording a little bit. There's some distortion issues. And I think maybe if we could get another cassette, if Mick the Hat can deliver this one as well, like he has on so many recordings over the years, we might be able to do something really quite interesting with Bournemouth as well. So hopping on to Recorder 2 for Bournemouth, there's plenty of copies around of that. So this is Barry's cassette. There are versions around that are said to be first gen, but I feel that lineage is highly unlikely. I think it's quite probable that we can do an awful lot better than that. There's a bootleg for Recorder 2 called Eclipse of the Dark Side, which is pretty good. A rather well-known, many people will know him, MOB, let's call him, is responsible for a very nice remastering of Barry's recording. I have a nice copy myself, which came from a US trader, which made its way out in 2014. But there's a bit of a fraction missing from the end. There's always some little compromise here with these things. But, there is going to be a good ending to this story, I'm glad to say, because the headline with this is like the Dome, Steve Bragger's first gen high-speed reel-to-reel survives for Barry's recording of Bournemouth as well. So there's possibilities here. So we can go places with this recording just like we can with the others. So there's my intro, Phil. What do you make of this recording, or these recordings rather?
I have two more small housekeeping details. One of them, and I think it's worth reminding, Barry Cooper's recording is often misdated as the 21st, and that's led to a fair amount of confusion. I think that Eclipse of the Dark Side release, when it first came out, everybody thought it was the 21st until they checked it more closely. If anybody out there is looking at their tape collection, be sure to double check. I'll give you a couple details that will help. And obviously the presence of Set the Controls to the Heart of the Sun is one way you could differentiate if we had the whole thing. But since it's the dark side, you just have to listen to it closely and try to tell the difference. But there's one smoking gun difference. The other thing, by the way, is that on Recorder 1, I think all copies, and by the way, Recorder 1 used to sound terrible. Like it was one of those shows that everybody would say, oh, don't touch. There were about 5 or 6 shows from 1972 where people say, oh, no matter what you do, it'll sound terrible. And a lot of those are a lot better now. And Bournemouth is one of them, where even Recorder 1, which used to be regarded as so unlistenable, is now very listenable. As far as I know, all copies of it have this really interesting print through on echoes, where in the first few minutes of it, for some reason, there's other music. The really bizarre thing is that the other music is in the same key. It's either the most serendipitous thing in the world or something else strange is going on. But if you think you hear music during the beginning of Echoes that doesn't belong yet works well with it, that would be an artifact of the recording process or a reused tape or whatever it might be.
I think I can explain that. That's probably going to be a 4-track reel-to-reel, isn't it? And if you record a 4-track reel-to-reel and you record it slightly hot, it prints through to the other side. And that's why, I don't know if you noticed this, but you can often hear at the end of a recording, beginning of the other side. Right. That's a smoking gun, that it's come from reel-to-reel. And I think I can explain why Bournemouth is often misstated as Portsmouth. It's because Steve Bragger has often gone on record as saying that Barry was so inspired by his experience of the Dome that he went back the following night to capture the dark side of the moon. He didn't. He went to Bournemouth. He didn't go to Portsmouth. And that's why this goes back a long way. So when I was looking at that box of tapes at Mix that led me to the Recorder 2 from the Dome on the 20th of January, there were other cassettes there, and one of them was indeed marked Portsmouth. So I was thinking, I'm going to get a nice copy of Portsmouth out of this, and I was getting all optimistic. It was a TDK C120. So the old 120 was ringing my bell, and it was a 1973 to 1978 type rather than tape, correct myself there. I got it home. I started to play it. Oh dear, it breaks. The cog had broken. So I had to put in a new cog, and I put in a new leader. And now it's got a very, very long leader. But it's Bournemouth and it's not Portsmouth. And even back in presumably sometime between 1973 and 1978, it was going around that Bournemouth was Portsmouth. When it wasn't. Anyway, we can wipe that all away because we're getting there with these. We've got this great source that we have from the Garibaldi source. We have the possibility of the first gen high-speed reel-to-reel from the Cooper source. We can really go places with this recording at some point in the future. So I'm picturing a series here at UFilm. Yeah. I think this could be quite special, couldn't it?
Yes.
With liner notes written by one American expert who I'm talking to.
Perhaps I could be persuaded. Perhaps. Yeah, I could be persuaded.
Yes, you could. Wouldn't that be a good job? But oh goodness, I'm going into official release territory. Yeah, we know where that leads.
Well, although as a parenthetical note, we're going to talk a little bit about Pink Floyd's copyright dumps and how they went very terribly wrong in the case of some of this. I'll talk a little bit about the music, if I might. I think I would evaluate this as a slightly less interesting performance than the previous two nights. I think, and that makes sense. They're settling in, they're feeling maybe a little bit more polished, but with a little bit less of an edge, and they don't banter nearly as much with the crowd. They've stabilized their set list for the second half. The next 4 shows, it's entirely the same. The next 3 shows, one of these days, Careful That Oxygen, Echoes, and then A Saucerful of Secrets. Gilmour, despite the fact that they're sort of easing in, Gilmour actually makes more mistakes in Breathe. He actually plays a chord too soon, and thankfully Waters and Wright sort of hold the line and they keep things on track. Breathe, he sings in much the same way as he did the previous night. And in the rest of the Dark Side of the Moon set, only a couple things popped out to me. Waters' enthusiasm for singing along is really quite evident. He's singing more and more obvious harmony. I noticed the line, "Listen, son, there's a job to be done." Not like the final lyrics of Us and Them, in Us and Them. Brain Damage is also a bit quirky. Gilmour seems to be using a approach to fingerpicking the song that, you have to be a real Pink Floyd nerd to notice it, but if you listen closely, he's doing something that's very unlike what he usually does, hitting certain strings more frequently and just playing it a bit differently. That made me, by the way, notice that people have pointed out that Brain Damage is really a descendant of Baby Blue Shuffle in D major, A Narrow Way, an Unknown Song. And of course it is. It's another song that has its origins and things that Gilmour was already doing. Roger is now singing the choruses of Brain Damage. Wright isn't audible anymore. They're singing in unison, though. They're not singing in harmony, so they haven't worked that out yet. Then we have another example of why it's so important to have 2 recorders for these shows in different places, because on Recorder 2, you can't hear the laughter during the end of Brain Damage into, what I call in my notes, not Eclipse, because it's not Eclipse, but it's a part of Brain Damage that certainly is not present in any later versions. It's the ending of the whole thing in any event. That looping laughter is very clear on Recorder 1, and you can't hear it pretty much at all in Recorder 2. So clearly it was probably panned to one quad stack. And for whatever reason, the person situated where they were just couldn't pick it up. Were it not for recorder one, I would have thought that it wasn't present at all, but it's definitely present. The Eclipse substitute, shall we say, is still pretty wacky. It's as wild as it was on the previous night. And I think the second set is mostly fairly workmanlike. One of these days, Careful Why That Axe Eugene echoes, they're all fine. Careful Why That Axe Eugene in particular, whenever they don't have much build-up before the scream, it can be a sign they're just kind of looking to get through it. And this version felt relatively perfunctory to me. However, the concert does catch fire with A Saucer Full of Secrets. It's one of the best versions I've heard from 1972. And it's a big giveaway for this band, how they feel about the show. You know, they can repeat sections in A Saucer Full of Secrets as many times as they want, including not repeating them at all. And in this one, it's I didn't do an explicit count, but I'm pretty sure they repeat a couple sections twice that they sometimes only do once. Like, in other words, they definitely build it up more. For those of you who know Kralingen, 28th of June, 1970, where that version of A Saucer Full of Secrets seems to go on and on and on. It's got a little bit of that flavor to it where it doesn't feel like they want the night to end. So that's quite nice. Yeah, I think the only other thing I would say is that, you know, it really is true that Recorder 2 is surprisingly nice. And if you listen to the version remastered by MOB, there were times that my notes say that it basically is like a dollar store version of the 20th of February, 1972, that famously good recording. There were times it began to sound almost as good as that in some ways. It's not as clean, it's mono, but I still had that feeling like, oh, like here I am, you know, with a direct line between me and the band, you know, sitting in the rafters or wherever it was that famous recording of Ian Sippins was made.
Back of the stage.
Back of the stage, that's right.
Yeah.
We used to think it was the rafters, and now, yep. So it definitely began to have that quality of, oh, this is a rather nice recording. So definitely a worthy listen, this one as well, and definitely one that, at least for the Dark Side set, plus A Saucerful, is worth busting out for your friends who don't have bootleg ears but can put up with something where at least all the notes are there, which is not going to be the case for all the recordings we're about to talk about.
No, indeed. Is it time to move on?
I think it is.
Shall we move down the coast a little bit further to the Guildhall in Southampton? So Bournemouth was on Saturday, the following night, the Sunday, the 23rd of January. They were in Southampton, and it was going to set me back on my little imaginary tour of these concerts for £1.25 for this night. I think I might have worked my way through all of these concerts for about £5, mightn't I? Which would be quite novel indeed. Wow. So I think we'll talk a little bit about the BBC, which I might leave that to you, Phil, if I may.
Sure.
The taper for Southampton is likely to be a chap called David Hendy. David posted in a Facebook thread that he'd been to the concert and that he recorded it and then went to ground. I think that's fair to say. I've had a little look for David, and various other people I can see have had a try as well, because that's one of the favoured approaches nowadays of trying to tape down items from back in the day, is to get a conversation going on in Facebook. But hopefully David will somehow or another hear this, and it would be lovely, David, to do a transfer that improves upon your MP3 copy that you mentioned in the thread that you had made of your recording. If it wasn't David, there's two recorders, so this gets a bit more interesting. It's definitely possible. And it'd be lovely actually to talk to David about the filming as well. So there's two good sources, in my opinion, for Southampton. To see whether you agree with this on film, with this film. One was transferred on a Sony TC-WE-475. There's quite a lot of wear, there's quite a lot of pops and other disturbances there. And that was, once again, Martin Balsam's cassettes that were used for that source. And Martin got his cassettes back in 1981, so that was fairly early on. The second one is in the collection of Golden Band, a Usual member, and I think you know a little bit more about that one than me, Phil, so perhaps I ought to leave you to talk about that particular source. So, yeah, tapes and BBC. Over to you, Phil, for starters. What do you make of this date?
Well, for starters, it's a really slippery one to get a fix on. I think, the copy that you mentioned had been gotten from a trader named Mike M. I won't use his last name. And that, in turn, was believed to possibly have come from the collection of a very well-known trader whose initials are VF. And I think Alice knows what that is.
Yes.
And where it came from before that is unclear. This is one of those recordings. Of course, it would be wonderful if Mr. Hendy's recorder turns out to be our second recorder, or if it turns out to be this one, as long as we're able to get a hold of it in a more pristine state, because this is one where you can tell it was well recorded, and then it's passed through either too many hands or too many cheap tapes or cheap dubbing decks. It's got just a fair bit of broadband noise. It's still actually, in my opinion, fairly listenable, but it's got broadband hiss, distortion, speed problems that were corrected very carefully on a release of this show that was shared on Yeashcall. It's got blasts of static, but still you get a pretty balanced, clear mix the whole way through. So, but before I go any further talking about that, we should note that there is a very persistent rumor. Can we say that it's not a rumor, that it seems to have been fact?
Oh, the BBC filming.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I believe it is fact. I'd like to evidence it myself because I've only read it in books and quite convincingly in books. Obviously, when you and I were researching the BBC, I had the good fortune to go to their archives at Caversham, and we were obviously interested in the radio shows at the time, but the archives were mixed, and the film archives came out with the tape archives and the contracts and so on and so forth. But they didn't go as far as 1972 because I didn't ask. I only asked up to 1971. So if there's anything in the BBC records, which I assume there is, and that's how others, such as Glenn Povey, are stating this as fact, there might be some more clues there. But he's quite brief in his book, so maybe there's not much else known. But they were apparently testing out some new camera equipment, and it wasn't intended for broadcast, so it was wiped shortly afterwards.
I think the odds of it surviving are basically nil. I just can't see how they possibly would have.
Yeah.
I don't know if the information we have makes it clear whether they were using film or videotape, but if it was indeed videotape, they absolutely would have wiped it because those tapes were extremely expensive. So that has to be something that, unless somebody really had a great deal of foresight, is probably gone for good. And frankly, even if we had it, Pink Floyd didn't really have the reputation of letting folks tape much of their shows. It was often, you can tape the first 3 songs and that's it, or you can tape this little bit and that's it. People will know that there are so many performances like Crowling in 1970, Brighton in 1972, where we have just a couple songs and that's it. Or for that matter, Nebworth 1975. They took a policy, I think, of just, you can only tape a bit of it, but we don't want to spoil the surprise, or we don't want people to peek behind the curtain. And even if you put that aside, let's say we had a bit more, there's another reason it might have been wiped, which is that a couple of things go wrong in this show. One in particular, they're also a big part of what make it interesting. I quite like this show. I think it's an underdog show, and I think it's one of those that if we ever do get our hands on the master tape, or something comparable to it, that people will reevaluate it, because I actually think it's it's not a particularly striking show, and it's sort of a very placid one, but it's nice. Now, there's one other bit of housekeeping too. I alluded to this earlier, but unfortunately, someone seems to have been advising Pink Floyd about what tapes to put into their 1972 copyright dump. And they've done a much better job of it in 1973. In 1973, they were quite comprehensive, but in 71 and 72, it was a mess. And the biggest mistake they made that I can think of was that they allegedly copyrighted this recording, but it is not this recording. It's not Southampton. It's not from 1972, and it's not an early Dark Side of the Moon. What they put up was Wembley 1974, just the Dark Side set. So they made a big mistake, because that has opened the door to grey market releases of this material in some regions. In fact, all 6 of these shows were overlooked, which is just ridiculous. If one of us had been advising them, I think one of the first things we would have said is, if you need to establish copyright control of these, you need to go after the very first show for starters, because it's historically important and it was well recorded. They didn't get any of these 6. What discussion you can find people having of this show is permanently tainted by the fact that there are tons of people who are listening to what they think is Southampton 1972, and it's actually Wembley 1974. So it's just, it's ridiculous. And if you listen to it if you know anything about Pink Floyd, you listen to it for 10 seconds and you know it's not what it's claiming to be, because they weren't playing it this way in 1972. So in any event, Breathe is back to being sung the way it is on the album, with that little bit of syncopation. The one thing that's kind of striking is that when Roger comes in making his tick-tock noises in time on the bass, he comes in doing it much too fast, and he has to slow down.
Right.
Yeah, he comes in, he has to slow down over the course of about a minute. He's going tick, 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 tick. It sounds like perhaps he's had an extra cup of coffee or so if he's imitating well, it's not a heartbeat, it's a clock, but either way. There's a funny botched line from Gilmore. It sounds for all the world like he's saying, "It's good to warm my bones across the fire," which sounds more like a crematorium than a campfire.
Yes. Dangerous.
But the really interesting thing that happens on this show is that when it comes time to start the mortality sequence, Rick Wright has an equipment failure. And I don't know whether it's the organ itself or whether it is something with a PA or what it might be. But we go to start the mortality sequence, and it's a bass solo for Roger Waters. Occasionally on these performances, Gilmore joins in a little bit during the early going of the mortality sequence, but typically it's a Rick feature, and here he's just not there. So at first, Roger's playing on his own. He's playing some extra notes to try to kind of fill a little bit more space. But I think he's a little bit like that famous video of Ashley Simpson caught tap dancing, a little bit, caught out a little bit. He wasn't expecting to have that kind of attention paid to him. But what Rick does, he improvises, and he instead grabs his electric piano and plays with that instead. And, it really changes the feeling of the whole thing quite radically. It's actually quite interesting. The organ sound makes it sound churchy. The electric piano is a kind of more pastoral, gentle, kind of reflective sound. So actually, in a weird way, it sounds more like the character of the music is more like what the song ultimately had in the final version with the famous piano playing and all that, minus Claire Torrey. It ends up just having a completely different character, and it's kind of cool. It also reminds me a little bit of the intro to Sheep in a funny way. That's about the closest thing I can think of, where that kind of electric piano with bass and basically nothing else, that's where we hear that, is on the intro to Sheep, particularly live. So in any event, it's definitely not an intentional thing. There's no way they meant to do that. It has all the hallmarks of oh, shoot, the equipment isn't working. Okay, plan B. His organ makes it back at the end. I can't really tell. I don't know Rick's rig well enough to know whether he's using a different organ or whether they managed to get it back online. But yeah, the whole effect is very melancholy in a funny way. And that sort of applies to this whole performance. It's not a fiery performance at all. It's much more of a mellow kind of atmospheric one. Unfortunately, when we get to Brain Damage, so Money and Us and Them, they stay pretty confident. Brain Damage, the tail end of the song, unfortunately, is subject to multiple cuts, but we can hear that looping laughter again. It just goes on and on and on and on. And then on the second set, I think we don't really get the kind of quality we were on the previous nights. It seems much more workmanlike. I will say that it's hard to evaluate because the sound begins to go downhill as the show goes on. I think whether it's the batteries are wearing out or whatever it might be, it just begins to sound more and more shaky, more and more brittle. And so this is one that I probably would not play for the average quote unquote layman. But again, if a better copy ever surfaces, it could be a very interesting and illuminating Dark Side of the Moon.
I was going to say, you certainly made me feel a lot more interested than I was in it before. And, talking about the quality of these recordings, I'm definitely there with Bournemouth, I'm there with Brighton, and I'm there with Portsmouth. But then after that, it does get to be a bit of a struggle, doesn't it?
Southampton is just a mess. It's one of those that there are certain recordings that were a mess for a long time, and then something came along, either a new recorder or just a really nice tape. And we said, oh, thank God, we don't have to piece it together from 5 different sources. Southampton 72 is a recording that is a bit like a painting that desperately needs to be cleaned by a professional. It needs, and this shouldn't happen, by the way, through dehissing software. It won't work. It needs to happen by going 4 or 5 generations. Because at minimum, the tape that is the best available copy has to be 5th generation, right? It would have passed through Golden Band from Mike M to VF Source, which obviously can't be an American. It wouldn't make any sense.
It was probably Mick the Hat.
Mick the Hat, and then he got it from somebody. So I think to my ears, it sounds like about 5 to 6 generations of broadband noise. And it's a testament to the quality of the original recording that it stood up that well, but it's definitely, now we're into bootleg territory. And I'm afraid we're about to get even further into bootleg territory.
With Newcastle. Yes. Is it time to move on to Newcastle? So the band is a week into the tour at this point and 4 performances. They've had 4 days off. Sunday, they were in Southampton and they make the long journey up the country to Newcastle, to the City Hall, to play there on Thursday. You get your cheapest tickets of all in Newcastle because they start at 50p and go up to £1.25. So once again, a bargain price for an interesting evening's worth of music. Once again here, the identity of the taper is unknown. And for this particular date, there is only really one choice at the moment, which once again is Martin Balsam's tapes. Martin did well. I think you've got one copy of it, Phil. like most people, and I've got a different copy with this one. So we may be able to do something a bit better there, because Martin used to very generously share his tapes with collectors. If somebody came along who was sufficiently enthusiastic, he would put boxes of tapes in the post to people for them to digitize. And a very giving man, and he's greatly missed, a good friend. And Martin's tapes went astray. They were stolen for this date. Before that, a chap called Pink Rudy, who was a usual member, transferred them, and Pink Rudy is not the thief, so I'm not casting any aspersions here.
It's well known in the community who the thief was, and if you're listening,
who the thief was,
if you're listening, it's
give him back.
Give him back. I would say the same thing in French if I knew how to do it properly right now.
Indeed.
Yes, so.
But a far better contact was Travis Simpson, and Travis also borrowed Martin's cassettes, and he transferred them using his Nakamichi RX505. So that's an awful lot better than the Pink Rudy boombox approach. So I'm not sure that one's done the rounds. So we can get a little bit better with that. And I did a little head-to-head in preparation for this conversation. And there is, it's never going to be a hi-fi experience. And it is a step down further from Southampton, I think you might agree.
I agree.
But it is fairly listenable in parts.
In parts.
If you can get through the hiss, you can appreciate a recording, which in this case is about an hour and 47 minutes long.
Mm-hmm.
What have you found out about Newcastle, Phil?
One thing about it is that the taper, this is a case where I think that we have a hard limit on how good it will ever get, because I'll sort of do a little bit of a spoiler and say the mistake was the tapers. And I completely sympathize, but he did something that, from benefit of hindsight, one should never do, which is, if you're going to turn the levels down, you don't do it at the end of David Gilmour's solo, right? You've already been through the loudest part, and that's actually what happens. So
really?
It's going along it's going along okay. And then suddenly, I think he got frightened when he saw what the levels were looking like during the tail end, like the very end of David Gilmour's solo on Money. And that's when he turned it down, which is the worst possible time to turn it down. And I don't blame him. Believe me, I'm grateful. But it's one of those things that I bet that if he's ever put any thought into it after the fact, he's probably kicking himself, because one thing is, from that moment on, the recording becomes borderline unlistenable. Now, I can still listen to it just fine. I think actually there are a lot of these recordings that have a bad reputation that are lovely to listen to if you are cleaning your house or doing paperwork. Obviously, if you're in this hobby, you're not going to be terribly precious about sound quality in the usual sense, anyway, although we all work very hard to find the best sounding copies of things. But I think that some of these, the noise, the hiss, the hum, it can almost give it an otherworldly quality. So as long as you appreciate it on its own terms, not Dark Side of the Moon at home live, but rather this sort of strange, almost seance-like experience where you get this tiny little thread of music going through this wall of hiss, then there's something there to be appreciated. But the last part of Dark Side of the Moon, my notes say that it's a little bit like trying to listen to Pink Floyd as they play down the road, or maybe over a landline phone, while you're sitting next to one of your window air conditioning units going at full blast. I mean, that's really...
Oh, love
it's
it.
Really,
it's very well summed up.
So another thing I want to note about this performance, by the way, is it has a very rare distinction.
What's that?
There is a recording from the same night of none other than Syd Barrett playing with the last minute put together bookie band on that very same night. So if you were in that neck of the woods, you had a decision to make, one of two places you might be. I don't remember what that performance was exactly.
I think it would probably be somewhere near Cambridge.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah. But that's one of the rare nights where you could see Syd Barrett or you could see Pink Floyd, but you couldn't see both.
Oh, what would you have chosen?
On this night, I would have chosen Pink Floyd.
So would I, actually. Yeah.
Fair enough. I've seen performers I care about struggle with mental illness, and you don't want to be there when it's happening.
No.
And I will say, again, it's possible that we've had some dubs that were made badly, dubs that were made on cheap tape, but I suspect that the problems we hear on this one are actually native to the master. And for some reason, Newcastle seems to be prone to this. I think the one we have from 74 has similar issues where it just seems like it's never going to sound that good. It's much better. Don't get me wrong. The one from 74 is much better. But it still sounds rough, like it was taped on cheap equipment. For all we know, it could be the same taper, and we'll discuss that in just a second.
Yeah. And don't forget, we've got a little bit of this Newcastle on the end of recorder 2 from the 20th.
Right, that's right.
We're at the Dome. So it's kind of like, is there a relationship between the two? I don't think there is. I don't think it's the same taper, but I think it's the same group of people who are perhaps taking an interest in these January 1972 recordings and perhaps trying to make them as complete as possible.
And who clearly felt that a saucerful that gets cut off was for them a kind of, forgive the expression, but a musical coitus interruptus, right? They really wanted to hear that ending, even if they had to splice it in from a different show completely. So clearly they made the effort. So musically, Gilmour only sings Breathe in the Air. He doesn't say breathe, breathe. He delays it a bit for whatever reason. He mixes up some lines in the first verse. He uses the last two lines of the second verse instead. And so he kind of makes up a new melody on the spot. He's improvising a bit. And they've had 4 days off, but it seems like maybe they're not as sharp as they were. Maybe they needed that adrenaline coursing through their veins. The opening notes of Money are one of many things that got completely buried in the tape noise. And really, it's just very hard to be objective about this performance, the second half of Dark Side of the Moon, because the sound quality is so poor. We really can't even hear the loop of laughter at the end. It could be a placement issue. But one thing I did notice is that there's a lot of kind of shouting and spoken word stuff that I hadn't noticed on earlier recordings. So it's possible they added some taped effects on that day, or that they simply happen to be more prominent in this recording. But I definitely noticed more pre-recorded carrying on, and it almost seems like the synths have begun to be reined in a bit. They're not as wild as they had been. We don't, however, have the very end of Eclipse, I don't think. And the crowd seems to be appreciative of One of These Days. I noted that as a performance that seems kind of above average, that they seem to give it a little bit of extra juice, and that Rick was very prominent. And then the most interesting thing that happens, arguably, in the whole recording, at least from a nerdy point of view, is at the very end, somebody says, right after, and this is only fully audible on some copies, some fade it, some cut it, but at least one copy, you can hear someone say, and that was Pink Floyd, and then they get cut off. And what's very interesting about that is that the accent is American, which is the last thing you would expect in Newcastle. You know, there are many places an American taper might have taped, but you would expect London. I wouldn't expect an American particularly to be in Newcastle. It's not. I don't think it's known as a tourist destination.
Well, it's one of my favourite discoveries on your part on this, and I think you need a job in the FBI, Phil, for noticing these things. So you've stuck your way through 2 90-minute cassettes full, and you find this, and I'm just fabulous. That US accent. Let's talk about that US accent, because it doesn't pop up anywhere else. We don't know of any other recordings from the UK that have got a US accent on them. I've been reaching out since you discovered that, and those in the know can't think of any examples. Is it a New York accent?
Not particularly. Certainly, he doesn't sound like somebody from Brooklyn or Queens or Long Island. No, it sounds like a fairly average, probably Northeastern. It certainly doesn't sound Southern, but it could also be West Coast. There is another possibility. Are you thinking of Larry G? Should we use his full name? Or?
Well, do you know, sometimes we make those connections, don't we? And I don't know, I'm thinking of something slightly different, because I had a look at who played City Hall, Newcastle. And so we're on the 27th of January, don't forget here. And who should be there on the 2nd of February? But New York band Mountain played that night. So just a couple of days apart. Could there be a connection there? Could they have been in town, or could a member of their entourage been in town preparing for that gig, and he's the taper?
And we do know, of course, that a surprising number of tapes that we have were taped by members of other bands. Yeah, we sometimes have to be careful about revealing that. I can think of one very well-known tape that was taped by a member of a fairly well-known band, a progressive band.
Yes. Yeah.
There is another possibility, which is that people like Larry G, who I alluded to a moment ago, they did like to put spoken word tags on the recordings they traded. And these are almost, there are these warm sort of pen pal-like letters to various traders saying, hello, so-and-so, this is this. So it is possible, I suppose, that what we're hearing is actually a mic in overdub as the tape is being made. It doesn't feel that way to me, though.
No, it doesn't feel that way to me either. And if you did, you would name the venue and the date.
Exactly. You? And it's so clear that the person has been cut off in a way that none of us would cut ourselves off. I mean, I have recordings that I made, always with the band's permission, of course, say I. But I have at the end sometimes recited the date and venue and band into the microphone just to kind of establish provenance. And it's true that when I've shared those recordings, I've generally omitted my voice because I just don't particularly feel the need to share that. It's very possible that the person omitted it either because he said, And that was Pink Floyd, Newcastle, 27th of January, 1972. And I'm here with my friends Aloysius and Bertrand and whoever, right? In other words, that it's too identifying.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting because it doesn't feel like he hit the stop button. It feels more like that's been deliberately removed from the recording. So a little bit of a mystery there.
Yeah. I think we're onto something here, and this is grabbing me. I mean, I want to find David Hendy. It would be nice. That doesn't sound like that would be too difficult to find him. He's posted about it. It'd be nice to find Andy Garibaldi to say, have you got anything else? Newcastle, this guy, I mean, I think putting that little bit of commentary on the end of the tape says to me, this is his first experience of taping a concert, or he doesn't do it often, or he knows it's novel and he intends to send it to people or share it with people. He's feeling a little bit proud.
Right. I agree.
And that wouldn't be perhaps the act of somebody who's in the mountain entourage, I would say. It made me think about, why would an American be in Newcastle? And
perhaps he had some coals
for us. Indeed.
Sorry, I couldn't resist that one.
I love the fact that these things have travelled across the Atlantic. So why would an American be in Newcastle? The first thing that we always think of in the UK is there an American airbase nearby? And there wasn't. Had a good dig around there. So most of the air bases are much further south in the country. They are often on the east coast, but they're further south. So it wouldn't suggest that he was an airman. And then the other thing that obviously, flows from this was this chap studying at Newcastle University. I have no idea. I have no idea whether Newcastle University was a draw then. Now, in 2024, it's an excellent university to go to. It's one of the places you might go in the UK if you wanted to do a master's in English, for example. It's amongst the best, very well regarded in that way. And, Newcastle has always had that strong reputation. So it may well be that there was an American studying at Newcastle University. You really got me with that one, Phil, so thank you.
Oh, sure. I mean, I'm pursuing another lead right now for a show from 1971 on the most slender of information. And you know what? I've had some wonderful help from somebody. Ironically enough, given the Newcastle subject, his name is Cole. And so, maybe it'll pan out, maybe it won't. But sometimes that Facebook message to someone who looks plausible, I've had at least two occasions, where I've sent that message and I've hit gold. It's turned out that I've found the person I'm looking for, and they still have their tapes. So, now we have one more of these, and it's the toughest one for me to talk about in some ways, which is Leeds.
Leeds, indeed. Yeah. So I believe that the best source for this one is cassettes owned by Nick, who's widely known as Beechwoods from the Yeashcall days, and carrying on the confusion that reigns throughout these dates. Nick's tapes were labelled as the Guildhall, Southampton when they came to him. Newcastle, by the way, is about the only date that doesn't get misdated, it seems sometimes, although, of course, Brighton's not misdated. But otherwise, everything just seems to have had a story attached to it at some point, which has taken it off in another direction.
I too, the first copy I got was supposed to be Leeds. Turned out to be Rainbow Theatre, 18th of February, 1972. The second recorder, the one with, at a time that it was apparently quite rare. I remember being told by a very well-informed colleague of ours that he was quite surprised that I had it, but it made it out as Leeds. I don't know whether somebody just simply transposed the digits or what it was, but it took a couple more years before I got a copy of Leeds after that.
There's quite a famous release that goes with this date called You Are Number 6, which was a good effort, but I wouldn't recommend it here. I think that one's been hit a little bit too much with noise reduction, and I don't know. I don't like to talk about tape speed, Phil, but I think this one, that one runs rather slow as well. So it was got right for Nick's release that he put out. Just coming full circle, here we have yet another unknown taper. We know who taped Leeds in 1970. It wasn't the same guy in 72. And that was a very good recording indeed in 1970. We don't know who taped Newcastle 1974 either. Maybe there's some connection between those two tapers. But Leeds is, bringing in the rear here on the Friday, having been in the Thursday in Newcastle. It's yet another mystery. What did you make of it?
Well, there's one more kind of tantalizing detail too, which it hasn't been 100% confirmed, but that, and this is where you really wince, that it's been claimed with some veracity that Leeds 1972 was taped over Leeds 1971.
Of course, yes. I should have mentioned that. Yes.
Yeah, which, I mean, I with all due respect to fans of Dark Side of the Moon, I would much rather have had the 1971 recording, of which we have 2 tracks, A Saucerful of Secrets and Blues, and it's a fairly, I would say, ordinary 1971 recording. It's not as if we lost something particularly spectacular from the sound of it, but still. And I think what makes it more painful is that the recording gets so fouled up. As Ian alluded to, one of the most distinctive things about this tape is the way that in the last part of Dark Side of the Moon through to the end of it and then into the first part of the second set, it is one of the most unlistenable, unfortunately, passages in Pink Floyd's recorded legacy because there are severe azimuth problems. So in other words, the tape gets muted and then opens back up and muted. It opens back up over and over again. And there is severe wow, so that the pitch is going up and down wildly. It's just clearly the mechanism is not properly engaged. This happened to me, by the way. I sympathize with the taper. When one of my favorite bands came to play at my college, I made a tape, and the first half of it came out great, or really the first 3/4 of it came out great. And then just when they went into my favorite song of theirs, it was time to flip the tape. And I flipped the tape, and for the first 2 minutes of the flip, the azimuth was messed up and it kept going. I mean, the pitch was fine, but it kept sounding like somebody was putting in a sock drawer and then taking it out with a very rhythmic intent in so doing. So something like that happens here, but it is very unpleasant, I would say, to listen to that stretch of brain damage into the first part of One of These Days, because it's just so, again, it feels like your hearing is being interfered with. So up until that point, in some ways, this has still been kind of one of my least favorite, maybe my least favorite, although it's between this and the 27th of the 6 recordings. The crowd is enthusiastic. And actually, when I listened to it for this podcast, I was beginning to warm up to this show. I think Gilmour is actually in fine form for this show. When he plays Breathe, he just sounds more free than he has on the couple preceding nights. When he sings, he ornaments his vocal lines. He's actually adding decorative ornamentational lines to them. He's playing in a freer way. The travel sequence sounds good. Then things get a little funky because during time, Richard Wright suddenly goes missing. His vocals, that is. So Gilmour actually has to sing most of it himself. I don't know how that affected their mood. But I would say that really, in my mind, it's that first set's disastrous end with the tape warble that stands out to me.
I don't think it can be saved, can it?
You can do something about the pitch if you spend hours and hours with a program like Capstan, or if we had the master plangent process, the one that I think the Doors use. But you're never going to be able to get back that high end. It would actually be better if it were muffled all the time, because then at least you get used to it. But then we get into the second half, and here the set list is, by the way, different. The last few shows had a different set list. Now we have One of These Days, Careful Weather, Axe Eugene, Echoes, Set the Controls, and the only one of these shows to have this, Blues. And the 2 that are standouts to me on this are One of These Days and Careful Weather, Axe Eugene. It sounds actually like a particularly good One of These Days, which makes it all the more frustrating there. But the really striking one out of this whole show is Careful Weather, Axe Eugene. And the reason is that unlike some of the other performances where it seems perfunctory, on this one, it really does die down after Waters says the title of the song. And when Mason hits his drums, it's like a gunshot. It's one of the, it really does pop.
Yeah.
And so this feels like a particularly good axe and a worthy one. And I think that's nice. But I struggle a little bit with the recording sort of more in general. I think it's one of those, it's quite distant. The high end is bright. There's not much bass, and it gets saturated pretty easily. But, on the other hand, it's a long show. I think it's the longest of these 6. And so I think whether it was because they knew they had a break coming up, or because they just were in a good mood that evening, or because they look forward to playing those particular songs instead of A Saucerful of Secrets. And actually, this is the beginning of the end of A Saucerful of Secrets. They retired it for a few weeks, and then it became a much more intermittent presence from now on in their set lists. They played it at the Rainbow a bit, but they often, as I mentioned before, they just weren't playing it as much. I think they were getting a bit tired of it and feeling like...
Oh, it's 4 years old,
exactly.
Isn't it?
They felt like they were still, pushing the same product that they had been 4 years prior.
Yeah.
And then that's how this string of 6 shows ends with the blues.
With a long concert, 2 hours and 10 minutes. But a somewhat disappointing one. And it's just a fascinating journey, isn't it, in terms of the quality of these recordings, the up and down nature of them. These are amongst some of the worst that we've got, but we've also got the best, some of the better, not the best, but some of the better recordings that we've got. Mm-hmm. And they all have in common such fascinating content.
They do.
And that's all part of the dilemma and the challenge that we're offered here with January 1972.
And if I were to just speak very briefly in terms of, I'm sure some listeners are thinking, okay, what came next? Well, as I mentioned before, a lot of tapes we don't have, right? For instance, Coventry, the next show, which was on the 3rd of February, that's a very, very famous millions of people have heard a recording from that night. Why? Because Chuck Berry recorded My Ding-a-Ling on that night. So, the means were available apparently to make a nice recording of that evening. But from what I understand, I'm just not quite clear on whether a recording of that night might exist. But I think with that aside, one thing that's striking is that 72 and 73 are actually a banner year for UK recordings of Pink Floyd. That actually the tapers working in that season. And Ian, I think you've described a sort of interval where the scene was beginning to flourish before people were beginning to be threatened by legal action. Yes. And I wonder why that is because actually I think if everything that had ever existed, some of which people's research has revealed existed and then is currently, its location is unknown. I'm thinking of one particular show, Ian, that you and I discussed recently. I know of only one show that there's never been any whiff of at all, and that is the 29th of March, 1972, one of the makeup shows they did after that Manchester show I alluded to. It is possible, although I can't confirm it explicitly, that just about every other show that Pink Floyd played in the UK during those 2 years may surface someday. But it would be lovely to hear it. I would particularly like to hear the Coventry show, but really all of them, because it seems quite clear that it was after Sheffield and Liverpool that they made some substantial changes to Dark Side of the Moon in time for the Rainbow shows, and then they began changing it incrementally. But there were definitely some big differences between those January shows that we've just discussed and the Rainbow shows that people tend to know fairly well because, of course, they have some very nice recordings. And so we can hope that someday they emerge. But for now, these January shows are just such a time capsule of the band doing something that they really only did one other time on the British Winter Tour of 74, really trying out brand new material and trying to sort of think through it as the tour went on, making these adjustments and being willing to share with an audience things that were often quite raw, where they were sort of hoping, I think, that something magical would happen on stage and that they would get to keep it for later shows.
And some things didn't they, that you've described?
Absolutely, yeah.
They did go on to inspire.
They did, for sure. And it's really, I think the strangest thing is when they do something on the first or second show and then they undo it and then they switch it back. I think that's something that we see happening a fair bit. Again, the biggest example is some of the ways that they dealt with time, but it's just fascinating how it almost seems like on one or two occasions they had the right idea at first, and then they kind of backed away from it and went with a kind of more morose affect for a lot of the later stuff. And then they went back to that initial good idea. I think the bottom line for me is that, people are well served by listening to the first three shows. The other three are probably more for adventurous souls only. But definitely the first two, Brighton, Portsmouth, and at least the first set of Bournemouth plus The Saucerful of Secrets. I think if you listen to those, you'll have a very, very good snapshot of what Pink Floyd were up to before they made it to the Rainbow in February 1972.
Well, there we have it. That's what I'm going to be doing over the next few nights. I think I'm going to have a little bit of a time travel to January 1972.
Sounds good.
Is that a good note to wrap things up on, do you think,
I
Phil?
think so. And I look forward to doing another one of these episodes where we review a period of time. Who knows what it will be, although I can say it probably won't be June 1994.
No.
But we'll have to see. We'll speak to what we feel we can do justice to. But this was great fun.
It was an adventure. And we hope you enjoyed the show.
This was Ian and Phil, recorded on September 19th, 2024. Phil asked me to mention a few things he didn't point out about the Newcastle and Leeds recordings. First, Newcastle was the first time that the band used a flexatone on the mortality sequence, a strange percussion instrument that adds a wavering, sliding sound to the music. Roger also has a funny line before Careful with Alex Eugene, saying, somewhere along the line, an oldie crept into this concert, and this is it. Finally, on Leeds, listen for the way Nick's taped voice comes in far too early on one of these days, and how a very good blues at the end is nearly derailed by a major timing mistake from Roger. For this, David Gilmour finds an excellent solution, simply playing over him louder and more forcefully. There's a metaphor here. I'll leave it as an exercise for the listener. So, thank you very much again for listening, and please do not forget to subscribe so that you don't miss any upcoming episodes. Bye bye.